It was a real thrill and an honour for me to be invited to contribute to the collection of essays on James Packer, and I want to speak just briefly about what I hope to achieve, what I hope I have achieved in the essay that I contributed to that volume. I wanted to do three things. I wanted to express appreciation for Packer's writings. I wanted to discuss his role in the British evangelical scene, particularly of sort of 30, 40 years ago, and I wanted to express a certain disappointment, I guess, that Packer was the great lost leader of post-war British evangelicalism. In terms of appreciation, personally, I think I can say with all honesty that I've learned more from Jim Packer than from any other single theologian. When I became a Christian in the mid-1980s, Packer's books, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, Fundamentalism and the Word of God, Knowing God, and Keep in Step with the Spirit were all absolutely crucial to my own development as a Christian, particularly the latter volume, which gave me a moderate and sane way to address the charismatic issue that was very prevalent at the time. Many of my friends, when I was converted, were charismatics, and I was looking for a sound, biblical, charitable and critical way of interacting with them. Packer's book, Keep in Step with the Spirit, really helped me in that. As I started to read up on the history of British evangelicalism, however, it became clear to me that Packer was a more controversial figure than I'd at first thought. The events of 1966, when Martin Lloyd-Jones made his famous speech calling for evangelicals in mixed denominations to come out from those mixed denominations and form a kind of popular front evangelicalism, really catapulted Packer into deep controversy. Packer, of course, famously disagreed with the doctor's call to come out, refused to leave the Anglican Church, and became something of a marginal figure within British evangelicalism as a result. Nonconformity, headed up by Lloyd-Jones, became very doctrinaire on the one hand, but also tended to shy away from the kind of intellectual engagement that Jim Packer represented. On the other hand, Anglican evangelicalism tended to move away from rigorous, systematic, theological and confessional thought. On one side, tended off towards too much compromise with Anglo-Catholicism. A more mainstream Anglican evangelicalism came to see the Anglican Church as the best boat to fish from, tended to downplay detailed doctrinal differences in favour of a kind of mushy, non-ecclesiastical evangelicalism. In that kind of world, Jim Packer had no role to play. I think that probably contributed significantly to his move to Canada in the 1970s. Quite simply, the English nonconformists didn't trust him anymore because he'd not left the Anglican Church, and the kind of Anglican evangelicalism that was developing without an understanding of confessional Christianity, without an understanding of ecclesiology, had no room or role for him. And that leads me then to the third point I wanted to make in the article, and that was that Packer is in a sense a failure. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about somebody to whom, humanly speaking, I owe more intellectually than perhaps to anybody else. Why do I say he's a failure? I think on two counts. One, he never wrote the great systematic theology that he was capable of. He could easily have been the Charles Hodge or the B.B. Warfield of his generation, but he never ever wrote the great magnum opus that would have established him in the pantheon of Reformed theologians. Secondly, I think his failure to come out in 1966 meant that there was nobody to challenge the authority of Martin Lloyd-Jones as the leader of English, Welsh, British nonconformity. Packer would have brought a very, very different very different feel to British evangelicalism. I think it would have been more confessionally oriented, more systematic in its approach, more rooted in the traditions of the church than ultimately became the case. So Packer failed. He failed to produce the great systematic theology. He failed to be the great leader of English nonconformist evangelicalism that he should have been. But as I conclude in the essay, I think that Packer's failure in some ways is also his greatest success. What does Packer represent? He represents the humble, thoughtful Christian gentleman who's never sought power for its own sake, never exerted in some ways the influence that he could have done if he'd ruthlessly pursued his own ambitions and agendas. And on that level, he's a great success. He represents a modest Christian model for aspiring church leaders and theologians today to follow.